We are live.
Okay, great. Well, call to order the Lake Oswego Planning Commission meeting for May 29th, 2024. Christina, if you could do a roll call.
Stewart,
Here.
Skinone,
Here.
Mitchell,
Here.
Rigby,
Here.
Chewing,
Here.
and Chair Moreno and Commissioner Najak are excused today.
Okay, great. Next on the agenda would be a city council update, but I don't see council member Memboop here. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he is not joining us today.
Okay. We'll skip that up. Next will be item number 4 on the agenda, approval of the minutes from May 13th to 2024. And I guess before I ask for a motion, I'm going to go ahead and give one comment that I had on it, even though I was not here. Somewhere along the lines, because I went back and looked at other minutes, we changed the language from those who are excused versus those who are absent, and I wasn't sure if that was intentional, if that meant anything between being excused and being absent. And maybe I'm looking at you, Mr. Boone.
Well, I am aware that the council recently adopted an ordinance, which has now been implemented, which eliminated the excused part and just said if you're absent, whether, for whatever reason, that counts as far as as far as whether or not you might be recommended or flagged to the council for consideration as to whether you need to be, somebody needs to fill in, whether somebody else needs to hold the position. I think what the council saw was the grounds for excused versus unexcused were not clear. And so the real point is that if members are not present, that's the bigger issue. So yes, it is intentional due to an ordinance amendment.
Thank you. Any other comments to the minutes before we ask for a motion for approval? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
All those or do we want to do an individual roll call, Christina?
Sure. Stewart,
Yes.
Skinone,
Yes.
Mitchell,
Yes.
Rigby,
Yes. Could you hear me?
Chewing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I think it sounded like it carried 5-0.
5-0.
Okay, next item number 5 on the agenda is public comment. Christina, do we have any public comment today?
I have none.
Item number 6 is general updates from the Commission for Citizen Involvement. Do we have any of those for today?
None.
Great. We'll move into item number 7 on the agenda, and we will be getting a presentation from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'll turn it over to Director Numanoglu to sort of give an introduction and set the scene.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Mitchell. First of all, I want to extend a warm welcome and a big thank you to Sean Edging of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. He's a senior housing planner there and has generously agreed to come talk to you tonight about some recent housing policy legislation that was passed in the last few legislative sessions. This is a great companion to the study session that you had on April 22nd, where Madison Thiesing from the City Manager's Office came in and gave you an overview of the legislative session that just wrapped up this winter. And in that session, we talked a lot about SB 1537, as you recall. And as part of that, SB 1537 is the establishment of the Housing Accountability and Production Office, which is a brand new office, which will be partially staffed, I think, by DLCD and I think Building Codes Division. Sean is here to talk about that this evening because that will be of very much interest to our department and the Planning Commission. And the other item that Sean's going to be talking about is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And they're currently under doing rulemaking on that changes. And as you know, we're well into our housing production strategy process, which will be adopted by the end of the year. And I think one of the big questions I have, and I think probably the Planning Commission has too, is what do these new OHNA rules, how will that affect our housing production strategy that we're currently working on, and then the update that we're expected to do in 6 years following the adoption of our housing production strategy. So with that set up, I will also introduce Johanna Hasty. I've asked her to join us. She is our current planning manager, and this was a great opportunity for her to kind of listen in on what's happening and also be able to ask some questions at the end. And so with that, I will turn it over to Sean. And again, Sean, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And thank you, folks on the commission, for inviting me. Again, for the record, my name is Sean Edging. I'm a housing planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And yeah, so I was asked to provide kind of a high-level overview of kind of two major areas of policy. It's not everything in the realm of like state housing policy, but they're two pretty important elements. One being the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which is really kind of like a long-term change to how we plan for housing, really with this goal to facilitate production, affordability, and choice in the long term. And then the other being this Housing Accountability and Production Office that is really intended to be a kind of resource for both local governments and developers in the development, in addressing barriers to the development of housing in the near term, in the short term, right? You can kind of almost think about them in a similar way to kind of like the distinction between maybe long-range planners and short-range planners, right? Obviously, both are very important to the functioning of a city, but their kind of focuses are a little bit different. And as we kind of get into that, I'm also realizing that the agenda appears to be pretty open. So I think we can structure this to be maybe a little bit more conversational and less kind of like I present at you for 15 minutes and then you guys ask me questions. But maybe what we can do is kind of go through this. I'll start with talking about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, this kind of broad change to long-range planning and state policy. As we go through, I'll kind of pause and we can ask some questions. We can kind of dive into some of those. And then we could do kind of the same thing for the Housing Accountability and Production Office, which is a little bit shorter. There isn't as much to that. It's kind of a newer thing too. But with that in mind, one of the things I do want to address right off the bat is how does this intersect with Lake Oswego's kind of existing process? So as we'll kind of talk about, Goal 10 is kind of an existing statutory responsibility that local governments kind of fulfilled through regular planning obligations. And that includes the development of these housing capacity analyses and housing production strategies, which this community has been in the process of developing over the past couple of years. One thing to know as we're talking about these changes is that there is a recognition in the policy that folks who are already underway with the Goal 10 process are going to be ushered in under the old rules, right? So this kind of recognition that like, hey, some folks were in the process, the policy's changing. We don't want them to have to restart their processes over again. So there's going to be this kind of recognition that all of these cities are kind of being ushered in under these old rules. And then they will, the changes that are kind of coming up will be applicable in kind of the next round, which is for metro cities once every 6 years, right? So it won't affect this process, but it will kind of come into play in future processes, right? So it's just something to keep in mind right off the bat as we start talking about this. I do have some slides that are kind of intended to be visual aids, so I'll share my screen. I shared these. I think I did change up the order a little bit because I was thinking about the flow before this meeting, and I was unhappy with it, so I decided to shake it up a little bit. But yeah, so I'll start talking through with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So this is something that came out of the 2023 legislative session. This was a series of 2 bills, one of which was House Bill 2001, The second of which was House Bill 2889, which was kind of a cleanup bill to the first one. And both of which we kind of collectively refer to as the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Policy. The basic idea is that we are kind of modifying the way that the state and local governments kind of plan for housing under an existing framework that is Goal 10, right? The thing that you guys have been kind of undertaking for the past however long, and really reorienting it around achieving housing production, affordability, and choice. I'll talk about what that means as we kind of get into the depth of this. One of the things to kind of keep in mind as we go through this is this policy is really intended to take this kind of what used to be this narrow, very locally focused kind of land exercise and really broaden it to this relationship between state and local governments that articulates that, you know, local governments have this role in making policy decisions, in developing local actions and solutions. And the state really has a responsibility kind of partnering with local governments, developing the investments necessary to facilitate production, affordability, and choice to really, you know, kind of be a partner throughout that process, right? So that's something to keep in mind as we kind of go through this. You'll see this reflected in some of the ideas as we get into it. And I'll start by talking at the very high level, what is kind of existing state policy around planning for housing. I think this might be something that many of you are already familiar with, which is the idea that we've had these long-standing kind of obligations and goals that we've articulated to plan for housing in the state of Oregon. These go back 50 years to the inception of Oregon's statewide land use planning program back in the 1970s. And the language that I have up here, this text right up here, is an excerpt from that goal. And without, you know, just reading this, you know, text to you outright, essentially what this articulates is that there's kind of this expectation or responsibility that local governments have in coordination and in partnership with the state to plan for and to encourage the production of a variety of housing options, and really articulating, providing a lot of choices for community members, including obviously a range of affordabilities, a range of housing types, a range of locations, right? Giving folks more choices in their community to, you know, be able to find housing that's suitable for them, right? And, you know, nothing in this goal has changed under this policy, but one of the things that I'll kind of point out, what we have on below this text is a diagram that's intended to kind of show what the old system of Goal 10 planning looks like. And this is the process that you guys are underway with right now. And it consists of kind of two major documents that are completed at the local level, one being a housing capacity analysis. Sometimes this is called a housing needs analysis. They're kind of equivocal terms. And then the second one being a housing production strategy. So on the left here, this housing capacity analysis, this was kind of the historic document that cities planned, met their Goal 10 obligations under. And essentially what this document is it's a land capacity exercise. The basic idea is that a city, they project the amount of housing that they would expect to see over 20 years based on a population forecast. Oftentimes this comes from the Population Research Center, though in the Metro, it comes from Metro. They have a distributed forecast. I won't talk about the nerdy details of that. But essentially, they, you know, take this forecast, they translate it into a projection of housing need, right? And they, from that, they're able to determine, all right, these are the housing units that we would expect to see over the next 20 years. And then a city also does an inventory of all the lands that exist in their UGB, or in the case of metro cities, kind of in their jurisdictional boundaries. So, you know, in city limits, and of course, any adjacent kind of urbanizable areas. And what they do in this process is they evaluate, all right, where do we have buildable lands and what is its zone capacity, right? How much housing can we fit on that land, right? And essentially the point of this document is to kind of compare those things, compare 20 years of need versus 20 years of, you know, kind of land capacity. And then you kind of do a math equation, right? Essentially determining, do you have enough land to accommodate that 20 years of need? And if you don't, you're required under state law to do something about it. That really kind of includes two major options, one of which is kind of building inside of a city's boundaries. So like you could think of things like upzoning different lands, or you could think of, you know, allowing more housing inside of a city, or rezoning lands, that type of thing. And of course, in Lake Oswego too, there's also areas adjacent to the city that you can urbanize into. And of course, also from the broader regional perspective, Metro has this responsibility to consider urban growth boundary amendments too, right? Expanding that boundary to bring in buildable lands for development, right? So that's kind of, that core historic document that really focused on this kind of math equation related to land capacity. But I think anybody on this commission would know, right? Just because you have the land and you have the zoning, that doesn't mean you're going to have the housing built, right? And so kind of in recognition of that concept, the legislature in 2019, so this is before the OHNA policy, they established this new requirement called a housing production strategy. And the basic way to think about this is as a 6-year action plan where a city articulates, all right, this is everything that we are going to do over the next 6 years to facilitate the production of housing, right? So going beyond just that land capacity equation and also starting to think about the broad range of actions or investments or solutions that that city wants to take on to facilitate production and get closer towards achieving, right, actual outcomes, right, rather than just planning for the need and having the land, right? So already in 2019, there was this recognition like this land capacity exercise is not getting us where we need to go. And so this additional kind of piece was added to that. And before I kind of move on talking about anything else, I want to maybe take a pause and just kind of see if we have any questions just about what this system has looked like prior to the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis policy.
Anyone has any questions? Yep. Thanks, Dave. I was just going to say, jump right out and ask them.
I did have one question, which goes back to your project population. And how do you project out 20 years what the population could be? And how do you factor in economic changes, which is what we're seeing now, where so many people are leaving the state for states that are more affordable from a tax point of view and such? How do you factor that? Because right now I think Oregon is like number 7 in the amount of people leaving the state overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so population forecasting, there's kind of an art to it. And I should mention, I'm not a demographer, so take my kind of discussion of this with a grain of salt. I'll speak to the statutory perspective, which is that for most of the state, if we go outside of Metro, we have essentially kind of this responsibility to say, hey, we know that the future is dicey, but we have to make kind of these projections of population that have some kind of basis in reality, as opposed to, maybe applying like an assumption that we'll grow at 2% every year for X number of years, right? That type of thing, which was something that actually happened in the past. But the basic idea is that we have these demographers. They employ these kind of, like demographic ways of estimating trends in population. They look at what birth rates look like. They look at what death rates look like. They look at migration in and out of a particular place. They look at how the population's aging. They look at all these different kind of factors. And they have these methodologies to essentially determine and estimate what we would expect that population to look like in 20 years if those trends kind of held, right? And so that means, right, we're always going to be forecasting into the future, and there's a degree of uncertainty as to what that looks like, right? But we have these kind of folks whose job it is to kind of grapple with those dynamics and to develop the best estimate that they can using those kind of methodological tools. Now, one of the kind of nuances here is that in the metro region, that responsibility for that kind of forecasting of population really falls to Metro, the regional government entity. And they, coordinate with the Population Research Center at Portland State University, but they kind of are the folks who control how that methodology is developed and considered for all these different kind of cities, right? And so, out-migration is definitely something that's incorporated into population projections. I know it's a part of Metro's forecast. They've actually, as part of their recent regional growth management process, they've also kind of, tempered their expectations for population projections in light of some of those out-migration dynamics. But in general, yeah, you're right. So like these are things that affect how we can expect things to move forward, but we also don't know exactly what the future will look like. Does that help get at your question? No,
that was a very good answer. Yes. So my last part of that would be, since it's at the beginning of the process, it would be really interesting just to have a session just on that to understand exactly, okay, here's our research and our numbers, and this is how we arrived at them, because that's so critical as you move through your chart. So maybe into the future, it's somehow we could get a discussion on that, as well as just, okay, here's our numbers. Well, how did we get to them? So we know kind of a starting point that we all agree on.
For sure. And I'm about to throw in some complexity into this. So hold on to your hats there, because there is a process underway for that housing side of the equation. But I do agree that, definitely talking to folks at the Portland, State University Population Research Center, of course, the folks at Metro who do population forecasting, would be an excellent discussion to kind of get at some of the methodological details that kind of go into that.
You started off talking about goals.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, what is the goal of the state in this process?
What the goal of the state is in this process?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So let me start with, maybe I should have backed up even a little bit further, which is to note that in the state of Oregon, we have a series of statewide land use planning goals, which are this, kind of broad framework that local governments implement. The local governments make decisions about what they want their community to look like, but at the state level, we have this policy that, we also have these statewide goals of things that we care about. Obviously, things like urbanization or protection of farm and forest lands or protection of natural resources, or, there's a variety of different things like natural hazards. In this case, what we're talking about is housing. And essentially, kind of back when this statewide land use planning system was founded, one of their first pieces of direction to, our agency and our commission, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, was to establish these goals. What are the goals that we're striving to achieve? That, local governments, they make their decisions, and then the state kind of reviews in light of these broader goals that we have. And in terms of housing, essentially the goal here is kind of what you see up here at the top. The basic idea is that we plan for and encourage housing production, affordability, and choice is the basic kind of idea here. And that's kind of the broad framework that all local governments kind of operate within. And of course, the state operates within the land use planning framework. There are other goals I should mention, obviously, in relationship to, environmental protections, in relationship to urbanization or economic development. I'm obviously not an expert in all of those, but, I could speak to some of them, at least from my cursory understanding.
Are any of these goals aimed at the rural centers of our state, where there's an interest in populating those areas because people are moving out of these rural areas because there's nothing there?
Yeah, so there's actually a few rural goals that really kind of get at this idea. So some of them relate to kind of protections of working lands. A big part of Oregon's land use planning program was this idea that, we have these working lands, farmlands, forest lands, and we want to make sure that they are, useful for that purpose, right? We want to make sure that we're not kind of unnecessarily converting them kind of permanently to other uses. But then there's also other elements too. So like in rural communities, a big part of something that they consider and think through is this economic development aspect of it, of this housing element. They're thinking a lot about, all right, we have these situations that we face in our rural communities that are different than urban communities, and we need to reflect that in our comprehensive plans and policies, right? So that's kind of a determination that they make through this lens of the statewide land use planning goals. Does that help kind of get at your question? And a lot of these are really locally driven processes.
Yes, that helps.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think with that, I can kind of move on. So what we've covered already, right, is this idea that local governments have these existing responsibilities to plan for housing under Goal 10. Kind of takes the form of these two documents. One is a land-based one. Another is an action-based one. And the basic idea of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and we're going to be using this slide a lot, is that we kind of keep these two major requirements intact. The Oregon Housing Needs Analysis doesn't add any kind of new requirement for a local government to do anything additional on top of these two documents. But rather what it does is it sets up a broader statewide system and a relationship with local governments that is intended to say, hey, our goal here is not just like planning for land. Our goal is to achieve housing production, affordability, and choice. And we want to orient the system really around the kind of local policies, actions, and investments that local governments take, right? And they kind of prioritize via their local processes, and to ensure that they are actually meeting those outcomes, right? And so what we have here is kind of these three kind of, I apologize about that. These kind of three major changes, and I'll talk through kind of each one of these in a minute, around kind of the different elements that are going to be changing in the overall system. So local governments are still doing that housing capacity analysis, and they're still doing that housing production strategy. I should mention, we're kind of in the midst of a rulemaking process. It's going to kind of tweak these around the edges to say, hey, the goal here is production affordability and choice. And we also have these kind of new requirements to incorporate equity and affirmatively furthering fair housing in our decision making. So those are going to be changing around the margins, but overall, the responsibility for a local government is going to be the same. They're still doing the same two processes. But what really changes are at the beginning of the process around how we determine need, and at the end of the process in terms of how we track progress towards outcomes, and of course, take action if we're not meeting our goals. And so I'll start by talking through this first piece over here, and this is where the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis kind of starts. I remember how I mentioned we talked about how there was a population forecast program where local governments would take a number that was forecasted from, a particular metro or the population research center, and they would translate that into needed housing. This has a step in where the state has a responsibility to articulate the needs for the overall state. And I'll talk about that in terms of talking about the responsibilities that different entities have. So what it specifically assigns, so I've talked about the Department of Land Conservation and Development, our agency, and I've talked about Goal 10 implementation. We'll talk about that in a second. But we also have the Department of Administrative Services, specifically the Office of Economic Analysis. You guys might know these folks as the people who do kind of revenue forecasting for the state, right? The folks who tell essentially the legislature, here's how much money we expect to bring in from tax revenue, and here's how much budget we're working with for the biennium. Those folks, right? It gives them a responsibility to conduct the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis on a regular basis. It also gives responsibilities to Oregon Housing and Community Services on the other half of the equation, which is tracking progress towards outcomes. So OHCS is the agency that kind of does affordable housing finance in the state, right? So they are the folks, if you see like a low-income housing tax credit project or a LIFT project, they're the folks who are financing those different affordable housing projects that we see around the state. And it gives them responsibilities to track outcomes over time, specifically how many units that we're producing, how many affordable units that we're producing, and how that stacks up with kind of our benchmarks, which we'll talk about in a minute. But let's go back to the estimate. So the Office of Economic Analysis, they have this annual responsibility. The state essentially said, okay, Office of Economic Analysis, you're going to take the state and annually you're going to divide it into these regions, essentially based on kind of census data. And you are going to estimate the need for that region. You are going to, kind of take the total amount that we would expect to see from future population growth. But you're also going to consider these other things that we never really considered in the first place. One of which being underproduction, the idea that, hey, we are actually operating at a deficit. We don't have enough units to house everybody that needs housing, right? And we can see that reflected in the fact that people are paying a lot of money for housing, that we have very significant, people who are experiencing homelessness. And we need to factor that into this methodology to essentially account for these housing units that should exist, but don't, right? And then also to consider other things that kind of come into play, right? A lot of folks have second and vacation homes. This particularly plays a huge dynamic in like the coast, for example, right? Where a lot of housing units end up being kind of taken offline, right? And they're not available for somebody to use as housing, right? So you either have to kind of prevent that from happening, or you have to replace that with a new housing unit that's available for residential use. So what DAS is kind of required to do is they essentially determine that need for these entire regions. They kind of consider all these different factors, they estimate that need, and they report it essentially by income, right? They develop it into these kind of different tranches of income, recognizing that people have different abilities to pay, right? So there's a complicated way that we estimate housing affordability in the United States. I don't want to talk into too much detail about that, but we essentially divide it into people with very low incomes, certain percentages of median income. And that's kind of how we've developed out these tranches. They align with kind of funding sources that we use for affordable housing. And the intent here is that we're planning not just for a number of units, but that we're planning for different affordability thresholds. We're thinking about high income housing needs as well as low income housing needs, right? They're both important to have a healthy and functioning housing market. And so they estimate that total need. And then they have a very important role where they take that need and they divide it up and they allocate that down to local governments in that region, right? And that means that essentially every local government is going to be planning for a share of the overall regional need. And that's very different from that kind of previous method that I was talking about, where you take a population forecast and you kind of you do your best job to translate it into a number of housing units. This essentially says, hey, we're going to be planning for all these housing units we haven't been planning for before, but still exist, right, as a need. And then we're going to allocate that kind of equitably to folks within a region. You'll notice I have an asterisk here on DAS's responsibility to estimate need, and that is to reflect the fact that this functions differently in the metro region, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But let's put a pin in that for just a second. I'm going to go back to talking about Oregon Housing and Community Services, and you'll notice that we have this bullet here that describes these production targets. So we've talked about housing need over 20 years, right? And like 20 years is a long time. Local governments, they do their best to kind of do this via the Goal 10 process. And the basic idea behind a production target is, well, we should have these goals that we use as a benchmark to track outcomes towards, right? And so the basic idea behind a production target is you take that 20-year need, you take 6 years of that. So in the next 6 years, we say, hey, we ambitiously want to set a goal to produce this number of units at these affordability thresholds. And that is going to be our production target. It's essentially a goal or a benchmark that we use to evaluate how we're actually doing in terms of production, right? And that's the intent. I'll talk about how that's used more in a minute. But what Oregon Housing and Community Services kind of does with that production target, right, is they use that as the benchmark to track and evaluate how we're actually doing on production, right? How many units are we producing in a particular community? How many affordable units are we producing in a community? How does that stack up with these goals that we've set? And how does that kind of stack us up, like in relationship to the broader region, in relationship to kind of other similar cities, things like that. And, the goal there is to get a better understanding of how many units we're actually producing, which is something we've actually, that might sound pretty obvious, but it's actually something we've never done before. And then the kind of second piece that they're doing, they have this second responsibility for housing equity indicators. So I've been talking a lot about production of units, but I think we all know that production of units isn't the only thing that matters in terms of housing need. What we care about are how people are doing, right? And so the basic idea behind these equity indicators is that they're tracking outcomes. How are different folks doing in terms of things like cost burdening? How are people with disabilities doing in terms of being able to find accessible, affordable housing? How are things like racial and economic segregation or risk of gentrification and displacement going in our different kind of communities? Because we care about these different dimensions of how outcomes are going in the actual housing market. We don't care just about producing units for units' sake. We care ultimately about the people that live in those units, right? And so that's kind of the second aspect of what OHCS is responsible for, really tracking production and, of course, outcomes. And that's kind of their responsibility. And then, of course, DLCD, we have these responsibilities in Goal 10 implementation, and also this piece called the Housing Acceleration Program that I'll talk about in a minute. Before we kind of talk about this broader, how does this affect local planning processes, I want to take a minute just to touch on the metro, and then we could maybe take a minute to pause for questions before I talk about how this affects local planning. So in the metro region, I mentioned that this relationship works a little bit differently. So for most of the state, the Office of Economic Analysis is the entity that kind of conducts this Oregon housing needs analysis, right? They do the math, right? And they perform that estimate, they allocate that need to jurisdictions, and those, they develop a production target based on kind of a proportion of that need. In the metro, right, we know that metro regional government has this very significant responsibility for planning for the region's growth, right? And what the policy does is it kind of acknowledges that pretty explicitly by saying, all right, in the metro UGB, right, where all these different kind of cities live, including, of course, Lake Oswego, Metro is going to be the entity that's responsible for doing that estimate, right? They're going to estimate need for the overall region. They're actually doing this right now through the Metro Regional Growth Management process, right? This is the process by which they kind of plan for housing needs for the region. It also includes their kind of urban growth report and their determination by the Metro Council of whether they expand their UGB or not, right? Things like that. And essentially that forms the total, but then the Department of Administrative Services, they have a role in allocating that down to local governments, right? Kind of, and they have some specific responsibilities in how they do that. They're required to consider things like population growth, right? So is a community growing or not growing, that type of thing. They're required to consider regional job distribution, right? We want to obviously put housing where the jobs are, right? So they're thinking a lot about how how housing is kind of reflecting that. And then they're also thinking about an equitable distribution of housing. Where have we built housing? Where haven't we built housing? Where have we built affordable housing? Right? And how do we make sure that we have an equitable distribution inside the region as a whole? So they're required to consider all these different things as part of the allocation process. But that's an important relationship, right? So you have this regional government, Metro, which estimates the total need, and then DAS takes that need and then allocates a proportion of that to all of the jurisdictions inside the Metro region. And so before I kind of start talking about the local planning process, the Goal 10 planning process, I want to take a minute there and just kind of pause. This is a pretty important change. I want to see what questions folks have.
I'll jump in with a question if you don't mind, Sean. Thanks so much
Sure.
for taking us through this. Is it fair to say that like a summary of it is in the new process, right? Because we're undergoing the process now, and I think I caught like nothing about this is going to change what we're currently doing. In the new process, Lake Oswego and the other cities, we effectively won't be doing our own housing needs analysis. It will be done by DAS, or in our case, Metro, and sort of be given to us. This is your housing needs analysis, and then we will just have to go forward, I guess, with the production strategies. That will be what the city owns.
Let me talk about just really briefly about kind of how this, like where this changes the local processes, because what I was saying is that a city is still doing a housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy as part of their Goal 10 responsibilities. But what it changes is on the front end and on the back end. And of course, some details in between to kind of make sure that we're planning for equitable housing outcomes, things like that. But where this really changes, if we kind of compare this to the first diagram where I mentioned here, where we have this population forecast that a city then projects into housing need, right? This is taking a number that's provided, by the state or by Metro, translating that into a number of housing units based on, kind of these demographic factors, right? Things like that, local incomes, that type of thing. And then continuing with their planning process. What happens here is that the state has this role in taking the total need, allocating a proportion of that to every jurisdiction in a region. And then what the region's job is, they essentially receive, here's the number of units that we need to plan for. Here's the affordability thresholds of units that we need to plan for. And then a city goes through the process, and this is something they do in the current process too. They make policy determinations about the types, characteristics, and locations of housing units, right, that they are planning on supporting in their community, right? So like thinking about things like, oh, we care about accessible housing or housing of this many bedrooms or this size. We really want to support housing production in this particular area because it's close to schools or it's close to jobs, right? All those kind of local policy decisions and determinations are still within the local government's wheelhouse. It's just that basis is being changed from this kind of population forecast to this actual estimate and allocation of need that is this kind of state responsibility now. That's the major change that happens there. It doesn't add any kind of new requirements for the local government.
It's just essentially changing the number that we're starting from, right? Whereas before, the number was just coming from a population forecast, and then sort of Lake Oswego and similar situated cities were saying we need 700 units for the next 3 years. Now the state is going through their own formula, and they're going to then send out the numbers to the regions, and that's going to be plugged in, and then the separate cities go forward.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
What do you do with your plan if there's resistance to it? Let's say you have a plan for building affordable housing, but there's resistance to it. Can the state do anything about that?
We'll actually start talking about that once we get into thinking through the housing acceleration program. Essentially, the short answer is all local governments have an obligation to plan for housing under Goal 10. This has been something that's been true since, when we've established this policy back in the 1970s. And that also includes planning for affordable housing. That's actually been an existing requirement. So this doesn't fundamentally change that responsibility, but it does kind of articulate that there's this broader kind of regional need that hadn't really been accounted for, and we hadn't been actually planning for all the units, right? We've only been planning for future growth. And so that's kind of the major change that is existing there. But if a city is like, well, we don't want to plan for housing, that's where we start getting into, well, state law requires the city to plan for housing. So what does that look like in terms of the off-ramp? And we can talk about what that means. But maybe let's put a pin in that once we start thinking about the acceleration program. But yeah, Jessica.
So this number that Metro will allocate to the various jurisdictions in the metro area, do the cities have any say in that, or are we just given it and we take it and we just have to make it work?
Yeah, actually, so this is pretty important. I should have included, I had one slide that was talking about this process that's actually underway right now, and I'll make sure I'll send it after the meeting. But essentially, there's a process by which, so DAS, they're doing the allocation, right? They're the entity that's responsible for it. They ultimately make all the decisions about what the methodology contains, how it's run, right? That type of thing. But what OHCS and DLCD have a responsibility that's also identified in the statute, and that process is underway right now. They essentially said DLCD and OHCS, develop a series of methodological considerations for DAS, right? Develop a report that kind of lays out, some considerations that DAS can take in developing an allocation to metro cities, and that should be informed by public kind of input, public comment, and testimony. And what there is right now, and I'll provide information and links for folks to get involved in this process, is that essentially over the next year, DAS has a statutory responsibility to first publish these numbers, these statutory numbers by January 1st of 2025. And in the interim, there's all of this process that's going to happen where we have the methodology available for kind of public comment, then refinement, then public comment, then refinement before it reaches a final form. So there'll be these kind of opportunities to kind of look at this methodology to be like, oh, we think that these things are really important to consider, right? And then, right, DAS, actually OHCS and DLCD kind of incorporate that into a series of considerations that we then provide to DAS. Does that help get at your question? I can provide more information. Essentially, DAS has kind of this interim methodology, essentially something that's intended to be changed over time that they're going to publish in June. There'll be a kind of period for public comment where folks can kind of read the draft. They can provide comments on it. There'll be a period of refinement. Then we publish a draft version of the methodology kind of for formal kind of public testimony and comment at the Land Conservation and Development Commission. This is a place, all of these places are places where cities can kind of participate in that process. They can provide their feedback to say, we think that this is really important to consider, or think that this is really important to not consider, whatever those considerations are. And then after that public testimony closes, that's when we develop this kind of final version or final set of recommendations to DAS, and they make the final call on what the final methodology looks like. Does that help clarify?
Yes, it does. So it's basically the overall methodology that we can comment on, but once that has been set and the allocations are made, we don't get to comment on, oh, you know what, we don't like this because we don't think you considered this, or this. We need to do it in the sort of the original methodology for the entire region.
That is correct.
Right?
Yeah. Yep. And ultimately, the final decision maker on it is the Office of Economic Analysis. Kind of like if somebody disagreed with the kicker, right? They might be able to kind of participate in the methodology that kind of leads up to it, but you wouldn't be able to appeal the kicker, right?
I had two questions for you.
Really quickly, actually, I believe Evan had his hand up. Am I getting out of order here?
Well, I was going to make a short response to Commissioner Shoshone as to what tools the state has if the city says no. Like a city's non-compliance with any state statute or comprehensive goal requirements relating to planning, the state has a number of carrots and sticks, and sometimes they get pretty heavy on the sticks.
Let's put a pin in that because we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay, but my point is I don't think we need to focus too much on that. Just suffice it to say that the state does have authority against to enforce, and if we're going to go down that path, we definitely need to talk with the council about it because it does have significant repercussions.
All right. No, thank you for that. And Dave, please, yeah, feel free.
So my question, there were two parts. Can you explain again who the committee is that puts that whole production target together? I mean, you mentioned Portland University. Who is that exactly that does that?
Yeah, the person who does, so the office that does the Oregon housing needs analysis, that includes the production targets, that includes the 20-year need, the allocation, the estimates, all that kind of stuff. That is the Department of Administrative Services, specifically the Office of Economic Analysis. It's not a committee or a council. It's essentially the state's economist.
Okay, got it. The next question I have, and I'm always curious about this, is I look at your map. You would say, if you look at this map, probably Lake Oswego has got the highest concentration of very expensive homes, and reasons why, because it's got a lake and there's things that make it very expensive. So and we talk about low-income housing that's going to be everywhere. But if I'm someone that's coming in from another state and I want to live somewhere on your map, and maybe I'm a young family just getting started, and I look at Lake Oswego and I say, yeah, I'd really like to live here, but it's too expensive for where I am right now. But I will look at Wilsonville or Sherwood or Oregon City, Happy Valley, someplace where my dollar goes further. And myself as an example, I lived in Beaverton for 25 years and finally said, we're going to make the plunge into Lake Oswego because we can now afford it. So I always just kind of wonder when we talk about low-income housing, why is it spread across everything and not more focused into areas where land is cheaper, services are cheaper, so you give someone that wants to move in even more incentive because just cost of living is cheaper. You're close to everything, but maybe not, right around the lake, which is the most expensive.
Right. I guess there's a question that kind of underlies this. And of course, obviously in any methodology, DAS is required to consider an equitable distribution of housing within the region. What that means obviously varies. Part of the direction that they have is to affirmatively further fair housing, which deliberately means, and this is kind of reflected in the statutory definition, of addressing patterns of racial and economic segregation. So the idea that we would make communities that, maybe have like these amenities, maybe nice schools, maybe nice jobs, access to community assets, and maybe also on the flip side, areas that are places with concentrated poverty, places with maybe access to environmental harms, things like that. We shouldn't be basing people having to live in these areas specifically on the basis of income. And of course, by proxy, also racial and economic, the racial and economic kind of component of that, that's like a federal law that we have to follow, right? It's called the Fair Housing Act. And part of the direction and part of the policy indication here is to say the idea that, a family that may want to live in Lake Oswego, but just can't because they can't find any housing that's affordable to them and they are denied access to those community assets, is not an acceptable policy outcome, right? Similarly, the idea that a family would have to locate maybe adjacent to a highway because that's the only place with cheap land and therefore have to be exposed to all the environmental hazards that's associated with that, it's also not a good policy outcome. So there's these responsibilities, not just for DAS, but also for local governments. And we kind of see that in this graphic that's provided right over here, that we have this responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. That's actually in the Fair Housing Act that affects entitlement communities, folks that receive federal funding. But the state has said, we actually care about this as a principle for the state, the idea that we should be providing choices for people to live in their community of choice without, kind of these like precluding them on the basis that they can't afford a place to live, that type of thing. That's fundamentally a state policy decision that the legislature has made.
Thank
you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Miles.
How do you get the enforceability for that, though? You may have a goal like that. You may have, the best intent, but how do you gain enforcement for that?
Let's continue on with the presentation, and then we can kind of dive into that question a little bit more, because I think a lot of these are really kind of getting at that enforcement question, that type of thing. But I think it would help if I finish the presentation, and we could have that full conversation around it. But Miles, did you have kind of a clarifying question before we move on?
Yeah, sure. If I could just step in. Are you able to hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's just the the screen's not switching over to me, but I think something underlying Dave's question was an idea not of racial or economic segregation, but of opportunities based on factors on the ground, like in that instance, land prices. So, another, we could also talk about, how built up an area is or something like that. Is that, so I think part of what Dave may have been asking, or what I heard in his question was, is that something that's going to go into the allocations?
Yeah, so part of what the allocations consider is this broader, like essentially consideration about like what population growth is going to be happening in an area, right? If a place is built out, right, they have obviously lower population that they can accommodate, right? And that's kind of reflected in a lot of the population forecasting that happens in the region. There's a lot of technical details that kind of go into that. But it is something that's kind of factored into this broader consideration. But there's also this idea that, hey, sometimes if we don't have enough capacity within our communities, sometimes the answer is that we have to plan for more, right? And so there's kind of this kind of dual component of that, where sometimes there's going to be this consideration of, hey, part of the effort here is that we're planning for affordability. Some of that is going to meet these kind of realistic constraints that happen on the ground. But there's also this recognition that there have been communities that have planned for quite a bit of affordable housing. And right, currently under kind of this old system of population forecasting, if that's where the low income folks lived, they would project the disproportionate share of low income housing that they would then have to be on the hook to plan for, right? Having this kind of disproportionate share, even though they've taken on the brunt of the region's affordable housing needs, right? So there's this kind of explicit recommendation or explicit recognition by the legislature to say, actually, we care about, having this broader share regionally that we want to, see in this policy. And that's kind of part of the underlying rationale behind this. But with that in mind, I want to kind of continue moving on to talk through kind of the remainder of this process. And then let's get to the end of this. We can start and we can pause. We can start, ask questions. And then I do also want to be sensitive to time and the fact that we need to move on to the Housing Accountability and Production Office. But let's kind of get through the remainder of these slides and we can kind of open up discussion. So I mentioned, right, that there is this process, right, that we have for these kind of statewide the statewide process to estimate and allocate need. Of course, in the metro region, it works differently. This forms the basis of local housing planning, right? That is part of a city's ongoing statutory responsibilities under Goal 10. That's kind of completed through a housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy. Again, these are the same requirements that we kind of have had historically. They're going to be tweaked to kind of incorporate the fact that we have this new basis for need and the fact that we're going to be affirmatively furthering fair housing in our plans, right? We're going to be taking affirmative actions to provide options and choices for people, right? And then this kind of last part here, I mentioned that OHCS has this responsibility to track outcomes, right? We have these production targets. The point of the production targets is to set goals. That includes, right, the total number of housing units that we're building, of course, obviously affordable housing units that we're building. And the point of these are to be ambitious and to serve as a benchmark to see how we're doing in achieving outcomes over time, right? And I think one of the questions that kind of comes up, and I think has been coming up here too, with like in relation to plans and policies is, well, what happens if we don't actually achieve that, right? What happens if we don't hit our target? And that kind of gets us to this next piece, which is the Housing Acceleration Program. This is kind of the major point of kind of what I would describe as kind of, like in enforcement or compliance, but it's actually something that is really based around the idea that when it comes to housing production, right, if we're trying to achieve, building more housing units, building more affordable housing units, that type of thing, the goal here isn't to hit a number, it's to make progress towards outcomes. And really what we ought to be doing, if we're not hitting our goals, we shouldn't be punishing a particular local government. What we should be doing is doing a deeper dive to figure out what's going on, what are the contextual factors, what might be the local barriers, the state barriers, market barriers that could be inhibiting production of housing in this community. And really what the legislative intent behind this is that there is this broader response that state governments, state agencies, and local governments take actions within their control to address need, right? So thinking about, all right, we do this deeper dive, we see we're not hitting our goals, we see we're not hitting the outcomes that we want to achieve over time. we do a deeper dive. DLCD is tasked with this responsibility to essentially figure out, all right, what are the contextual factors that are happening in a community? Is there local opposition to affordable housing? Is there maybe, state funding gaps that exist in terms of like transportation infrastructure or water infrastructure? What are the barriers that could be inhibiting production? And what are the actions that we can take at the state level and of course at the local level to address those barriers and to achieve outcomes that we want to see? And so one of the points behind this is that kind of through this process, if we see that we're not achieving these outcomes, we do this deep dive and we essentially agree to take actions within our control. And one of the things that's important to mention here, I think a lot of folks ask what those compliance tools are. A lot of this starts right with this idea that we're going to work together to address actions within our control. The compliance or enforcement pieces really only come if a city doesn't take action to address need, right? The idea of essentially saying, well, we don't want the housing, so we don't want to do X, Y, and Z. And so, kind of fail to either enter that agreement or fail to kind of take actions that are specified within that agreement that, the city and DLCD have kind of agreed to. And so that's where we kind of start getting into some of the enforcement tools. For the sake of brevity, I won't talk about them now, but they really relate to kind of existing statutory authority that I believe Evan mentioned previously around kind of the LCDC enforcement order. I don't want to talk too much about that. I think the intent of this program is that would be actually a pretty rare outcome, because really the intent is to have that partnership to address barriers to the production of housing before you even reach that point. So with that in mind, I do want to mention we are actually in a process right now to kind of define, right? We have the statutory direction that the legislature set forth. They set all these principles for us. They also gave our agency direction to do rulemaking to operationalize the statute, right? So the legislature set the big picture, said this is what we want to see in terms of outcomes on the ground, and this is the broad framework. DLCD get into the weeds on how this functions exactly. So all the pieces about that I mentioned about like how do cities make that translation of housing need based on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis? How do they affirmatively further fair housing? How does this housing acceleration program work? How do we urbanize and make sure we have development ready lands and that we're serving it with infrastructure to achieve production? All of these are things that DLCD has been directed to develop all these detailed rules on. We have different kind of statutory deadlines that are kind of you see here below. And I think one of the things that I might want to point out is like, this is a place where we want people's feedback, right? And so we have this process that's underway. We have a rulemaking advisory committee, technical advisory committees that are intended to give us, feedback on that process. Of course, we welcome public comment from anybody. And of course, we have an entire rulemaking page with, of course, more information on how folks can be involved. We definitely want to hear, obviously, the perspective from local planning commissioners, folks on the ground, in terms of how we operationalize this program. So it's something that we would definitely encourage. But I think with maybe that, I want to back up a little bit and just kind of ask more about those questions. I know we had some that were really related to enforcement and compliance. So I wanted to kind of take a minute to see if what questions folks might have around this, the intent of this acceleration agreement, and how that is operationalized on the ground. And one thing I'll mention too, after we're done with this, we're going to pivot and then talking about the Housing Accountability and Production Office, right? So we want to make sure that we have enough time for that discussion.
How do you obviate the whole issue of one size fits all? I know you've got a concept for that, but how do you avoid that? I mean,
yeah,
you show us the map and we look at those geographical areas and we know that within those areas there are different businesses and so forth like that attract people to move there. But how do you make an overall program like this work in the varied areas that we are looking at here just in the metro area?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I think part of it comes down to the relationship that happens between local governments and the state in response to the housing, like this entire housing planning process. And remember that idea that I mentioned before, that the idea that, the local government's kind of role under this program is that policy making, the decisions, the solutions that get us towards housing production, affordability, and choice. And the state's role is that kind of partnership, investment, right? That kind of role that we see. And really what's articulated here is this Goal 10 process, this housing capacity analysis and production strategy. This is a place where a city articulates what their plan is right? What are the things that they're going to do to facilitate production, affordability, and choice, as well as affirmatively further fair housing, right? This is their policy document where they have this ability to kind of, really set forth what their policy priorities and agendas are in a way that's not very one size fits all. DLCD has a role in reviewing that and making sure it kind of meets the overall parameters of the program, but ultimately it's a city determination as to the types of policies that they choose, what they choose to prioritize, all those different types of things. And really where the state's role kind of comes in, even in this housing acceleration program, this is saying, all right, so that process happened, and maybe we're not achieving the outcomes that we want to see, even in spite of this housing production strategy. And so this is intended to say, all right, let's hone in on what those barriers are, right? And DLCD has this role in identifying the barriers. But then when it comes to actually entering an agreement, this isn't the DLCD telling the city you have to do X, Y, and Z. It's saying, here's the barrier. There's multiple ways that we can address that. Some might be local, some might be state. Let's have a discussion and conversation about which ones are suitable and right for the city. So not necessarily a one size fits all, but something that's more, right, a conversation or dialogue between the city and DLCD, right? So it's kind of a balance, right? Local governments have a lot of policy and decision-making authority under this, but the broader goal, the statewide vision of achieving production, affordability, and choice that's reflected in this policy is that policy direction, right? And the role that DLCD has in that process is really looking at those broader barriers and trying to identify solutions in partnership with the city. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, and I can just have one more tied into that. Do you have a plan for enlisting public support for that? By that I mean, do you have a plan for informing people, let's say in a city like Lake Oswego, this is our hope for the direction of this city. This is what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a plan for that? Is there a thought like that goes on?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of I'd say it's a complicated question, and I would say that there's kind of a twofold aspect to it. So on the local side of the equation, a big part, and this is something that a lot of local governments have emphasized, is really building this kind of education and support around housing production, why it's important for a community, right? All those different kind of pieces that are necessary, right, to think about that kind of public knowledge and buy-in for, like different housing outcomes that the city wants to pursue. That's going to continue to be an important part. DLCD cannot one size fits all that, right? Because every community has their own local context. But I think what is acknowledged here is this idea that essentially the state policy direction is that we all have a responsibility in terms of taking actions within our control to facilitate progress towards outcomes, right? And one of the things that this kind of articulates is this idea that, hey, we are not achieving our goals here, and something we're going to do is take actions to address those, right? It's kind of like there are choices that local governments can make, some of which might be very important for our local community members. Some might be, maybe non-starters for local community members. The point is that we're doing something, and the alternative to that is that there is this kind of more prescriptive, kind of compliance-oriented path that does involve these kind of harsher tools that, right, is essentially the alternative to kind of taking actions that local governments and community members can get buy-in and support around, right? So the intent of this policy is to say the idea that, like, we want local governments and we want local community members to build buy-in to their overall, like whatever policies and promotions that they take. But the idea that is that they are going to be taking actions to facilitate these outcomes, right? The goal is production, affordability, and choice. The legislature has set that policy direction.
Thank you.
Does that help get at your question? It's complicated, right? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Philip.
Yeah, thanks. So what do you see the role of TriMet is in all this? So we've got all these cities, including like Oswego in the metro area, that have these various strategies for creating affordable housing, urbanized housing, high density housing. All this is going to need public transit support. And some of these cities, such as ours, does not currently have good regular public transit. So who puts the pressure on TriMet once, we're in the process of implementing these things to get better service?
Yeah, so I'll actually take that question and I'm going to broaden it to more than just TriMet, because there are other folks who are equally important for the development of housing. A great example is clean water services, right? So, and this kind of gets at a broader conversation that the state and this policy kind of recognizes, which is the idea that for the development of housing to happen, it's more than just a local government's responsibility. There are a variety of players and actors that act in this space that really affect, especially things like infrastructure provision. So obviously, transit is one of them, and TriMet has a role in that. But that also includes like water infrastructure, road infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, all the things that are necessary to make, development like served and ready for development, right? And I'm sure you guys have seen this obviously in like case by case, right? And with maybe like subdivisions, things like that. Those are very necessary prerequisites for development to happen, and we all have a role in that. And so what this articulates, what this policy has, there's one component that is this element. I didn't dive into it because it's kind of a technical detail, called development ready lands, which is essentially an acknowledgement that land has to be serviceable with infrastructure in order to actually develop with housing. And we should actually start tracking and evaluating where we have development ready lands and paying attention to those investments that we're making. And then the second aspect of this is acknowledging that special districts, including TriMet, including Clean Water Services, all of these folks, they have a role in this acceleration program too. They have a role in the overall housing production strategy. And that includes obviously Metro, that includes a lot of different entities have this responsibility. And that is reflected in the fact that, let's say we identify these barriers, let's say we're not achieving our goals. One of the things that we would be looking towards are, well, what are those regional dynamics, right? What is Metro doing? What is TriMet doing? What is Clean Water Services? What are all these different entities doing? What are those barriers that could be existing? And what DLCD's role in that is to kind of mediate with the local government and that particular entity to say, hey, we can take actions here to address some of the barriers that we see to production, right? Recognizing that broader responsibility that we all have. That's actually something that's pretty important to the policy. Does that help get at your question?
Yes, it does. And I just, it's been a recurring conversation amongst our commissioners over time, specifically the TriMet issues, because we actually over the last few years have lost some service. And if we're going to make the commitment of bringing affordable housing and high density housing to the market, I feel like it needs to be supported.
Yeah, and I should mention any housing requires infrastructure. So this conversation definitely is deeper than just transit, but that is true. Yeah, transit is an important part of that equation. All right. So I want to take maybe just one more minute. I do want to be sensitive to time. How much more time do we have on this agenda item? Because I do want to pivot to talking about the HAPO.
Take as much time as you need, Sean. We want to get through it. We want to hear it, and we obviously want to leave open the questions for the commissioners and staff.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, then let's pivot to, let's take a minute. Let's see if there's any kind of last questions before I start talking about the Housing Accountability and Production Office, because we're kind of shifting now, right? We talked about this long range policy, right, with kind of local policy determinations and kind of state, the state role in partnership and investment. This is a really long range. And the Housing Accountability and Production Office, this is something that came out of the governor's office, right, via a policy that was passed in the short session, which we'll talk about. But this is really getting into more like short range, thinking about, kind of more in the development process and thinking about how to remove obstacles to the barrier of production in the near term. But before I kind of pivot to that and start talking about this new piece of direction, I just want to make sure that there aren't any kind of lingering questions about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that I haven't touched on.
I think we're good.
All right. Well, then let's continue on. So as I mentioned, Housing Accountability and Production Office, I believe this was mentioned at the top of the presentation by Jessica, but this is an office that was something that came out of the 2024 short session. And specifically, this came from, so in the 2024 short session, which is something that happened at the beginning of this year, there were a series of bills, many of which intersected with land use, and of course, a lot that were intersecting with kind of housing, urbanization, infrastructure to support housing, all that type of thing. But this piece of kind of direction to DLCD, and again, I'm not going to be talking about all these bills, but this piece of direction that came to DLCD was out of Senate Bill 1537, which is the governor's housing production framework. So if you've read the articles, essentially the governor had kind of one major bill that was part of the 2024 session. This was that bill, and it included a lot of different things. I believe you folks have had a primer on that, have talked through some of the kind of different components. I'll mention there's a lot in this bill that I'm not going to be speaking to, not because they're not important, but just because the intent for this, or what I was asked to present on, was kind of how the Housing Accountability and Production Office is intended to function. So I won't be talking through all these different kind of individual components that were also part of Senate Bill 1537. I'll raise, if you guys have kind of some lingering questions or anything like that, I'm happy to kind of speak to the best of my ability and knowledge of statute. I don't want to cut that off, but really what I'll be focusing on is what this office is. And really what the office is intended to be is a kind of direction to two agencies. So that's our agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and to the Building Codes Division. They are part of the Department of Consumer and Business Services, so DCBS. And it's essentially direction to both of us to enter into an interagency agreement to establish a joint office. And the point of this joint office is to provide support for the development of housing, specifically for local governments and housing developers. And where I mentioned previously that the OHNA was really about long range, this is really all about the development process, that short range kind of planning piece, right? So thinking about development codes, thinking about development processes, that type of thing. And the HAPO's roles can be best described in kind of three major buckets of things. One is that they are tasked with thinking about the implementation of state housing laws as it intersects or relates to the development process. So like how residential development is kind of regulated on the ground. An example of this, if you guys are thinking about state housing laws, many of you might have participated in Lake Oswego's code amendments that related to middle housing, right? So the state back in 2019 adopted a law that said, we're going to allow middle housing in our communities. Here are the parameters around that. Then local governments adopted development code updates to kind of conform with that. That's an example of a housing law, right? There are other examples of it. For example, clear and objective standards, right, that are applied to housing developments. That's an example of something that is, state law has these parameters on how housing is regulated and how housing development occurs in cities. And the intent of this is to have this office be a resource for both local governments and housing developers. And they do that in a couple of ways. One is that you staff it with technical experts who understand these housing laws, are able to communicate with developers and with local governments to kind of be like, all right, here's the statute, here's the applicable administrative rules, all the things that kind of intersect with this particular issue. And, here's how state law intersects with it, right? So you have the technical expertise. You also have funding that's provided to the HAPO, essentially to say, hey, sometimes, codes sometimes get inconsistent, they get outdated over time. And the intent of this is to have this pot of funding that is replenished every once in a while for the purpose of providing support to local governments to update codes where we might identify, maybe there's a conflict, or maybe a local government knows about maybe some inconsistencies with state law that they want to fix. It provides this avenue and these resources to say, hey, look, we really want to amend our codes to, conform with state laws in XYZ way, right? So it provides that funding resource. And then finally, and this is a very important function that it has, it provides this avenue to kind of resolve disputes that can sometimes happen between developers and local governments that's separate from these kind of formal processes that we have with formal and legalistic processes that we have with LCDC and the Land Use Board of Appeals. So if we go back to like the development review process, right? Oftentimes, if there's maybe a disagreement in state, like how the applicability of state law to a particular thing, or maybe you just have an ornery developer, right? Sometimes what can happen is that they might appeal a particular land use decision to the Land Use Board of Appeals, or maybe a third party appeals it, right? There's a lot of different ways that can happen to the Land Use Board of Appeals, who then adjudicates on a particular case, and they develop a judgment. They have tools in their belt that essentially includes remands or reversals. And of course, that can be appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, right? You enter the legal process, right? There's also an LCDC enforcement order process that citizens can initiate, but that tends to be pretty rarely used. Essentially, we have the avenues that exist are kind of legalistic, and they're antagonistic between local governments and developers. What this opens, what this office also has a function to do, is to serve as this avenue for resolving these disputes, to essentially kind of intake complaints, to be able to evaluate, all right, how does state housing law intersect with this, and to provide options for, mediation, or options for, maybe there is a violation and there's kind of ways to address that or remedy it. This kind of avenue or off branch, or maybe there is no violation of housing laws, essentially to provide this avenue that isn't appealing a decision, that can help resolve issues or conflicts in state housing laws without requiring legalistic avenues. Does that make sense? And I'm going to pause on that before I start talking about these other elements around coordination and kind of study and research and guidance, because that's a very important function of this office, which is really around that intersection of state housing laws and the residential development process. Yeah, Miles.
If a party thinks that a violation is occurring, why would he not want to go in a legalistic direction?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when you appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals, first you have to hire an attorney, and then you have to, wait for the decision to be made. Then you have to appeal said decision. Then you have to go to LUBA, and you have to have them render a judgment on it. If you're wrong, that decision is going to stand, and you've just wasted a bunch of time and money doing that type of thing. And if you're right, most likely what's going to happen is that's remanded. You kind of repeat the process over again, right? There's this kind of lengthy and expensive legal process that you have to undergo. And also, same for the local government, there's this kind of expenditure that you have to provide because, appeals are very expensive. And there are plenty of cases where, maybe the legalistic avenue is the right route for folks. That option's always available for folks. People are still going to appeal decisions. That's something that happens. But the point of this office is to be a resource of essentially people who are familiar with state law, who can opine on these different types of things. They could say, hey, we know about clear and objective standards, right? We know how that intersects with housing development codes. Part of our job is reviewing ordinances to make sure that codes are clear and objective. And we can talk about how they intersect with these particular statutes without having to go down this legalistic route. Kind of similar for local governments, it provides them an avenue to say, hey, look, we have these codes. We know that, these particular things have been kind of outdated for a little while, but we haven't had the resources to be able to kind of fix those things. And the HAPO provides this resource to say, hey, we got the funding, we got the technical expertise, and the ability to help cities kind of address those different types of problems. So really, it's intended to provide both this technical expertise and funding to resolve these problems that didn't actually exist before, right? And so what a city would have to do is maybe they'd have to sit with maybe some legally risky code, right? And then wait. And then if you have a developer that decides that a legalistic process is worth it, then you end up in this kind of very lengthy and expensive process where the outcome's uncertain. And the intent is to kind of provide this alternative that is, really just a kind of a resource and authority on different kind of state housing laws. Ultimately, they don't determine what the laws are, right? That's LUBA's job, right, as the judicial branch. But the HAPO kind of provides this additional support and expertise that's supposed to be helpful for both local governments and for housing developers.
But so would that look like, say I am a developer, I think that, there is a city code that is not in keeping with, with the goals. So, would I would go to this, new agency, and they would give me a legal opinion on whether I would have a good case? Is that what that would look like?
No. So, and let me start by saying this: there's a process that's set out in the statute, and they kind of give broad direction, but there's a lot of specifics that we don't know the answer to yet because we have to hire the staff, right? Who are responsible for setting up the office, and that they have a deadline to do that, all that type of stuff. But let's start with the process that is articulated in statute. What they say is that the HAPO, starting on July 1st of 2025, they essentially have to set up a process to intake complaints. And the point of these complaints is, maybe a developer says, hey, this standard isn't clear and objective, or there's some problem that exists that they think it might violate state law. And essentially, the point is that they submit that to the Housing Accountability and Production Office. We have a process to intake and to review kind of the credibility of that complaint. Like, is this a realistic complaint? Is somebody just grumpy because, XYZ type of thing? And then we have a process. It essentially says to the HAPO, develop a process to provide responses to these, right? Is that standard not clear and objective? Is that standard, maybe it is clear and objective, and essentially figure out the pathways to say, how is the HAPO going to intersect with this and provide feedback to both the person who submitted the complaint as well as the local government, right? We don't know exactly what those processes are going to look like, but it says that, the law says that we have to establish this system to kind of receive and evaluate complaints and to be able to provide, right, at least our the staff's opinion, or not opinion, it's not a great word, but the staff's understanding of state law and how that might intersect with a particular, development proposal.
But
Not so much legal opinions.
Well, I'm sort of wondering, what that really does. So say, HAPO says, it looks like, this code, is, not in keeping with, state land use policy. And that just sits there, that's just, that's the opinion of HAPO. So, do what you will with that.
No, and this is probably something I should, this is important to mention. It also provides tools to the HAPO. Like, let's say the HAPO does identify a potential, like an actual violation of state housing laws, like maybe the standard isn't clear and objective when it should be. What they are directed to do is essentially to offer kind of these options for voluntary, like addressing or remediation of the issue, to offer maybe technical assistance to fix a code, or maybe, offer model codes that can alleviate the issue without having to amend codes. Essentially provide these options for kind of off-ramp, maybe mediation with the developer to be able to kind of resolve the issue. But it also provides, barring that, if a particular jurisdiction says thanks but no thanks, and they don't want to change that particular thing, it does provide authority to the HAPO to say, okay, we have certain enforcement authorities that are really kind of an extension of DLCD's existing authorities. Essentially, it gives them the ability, similar to housing developers or anybody who participates in a land use process, to participate in land use decisions. And that is something that DLCD has right now, but it extends that authority to the HAPO to say, all right, you have this responsibility to think about the housing development process. Your main goal is to really offer this avenue to really lead with technical assistance, to lead with support, to lead with voluntary mediation, all these different types of things. But, right, if there is a violation of housing laws that you guys have identified, you do have these tools to, say, participate in an appeal or participate in an LCDC issued enforcement order. And those tools, again, they're intended to be fairly rarely used, but it does provide that authority to the HAPO. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but so that last thing you were saying there is, it is not initiating it's not rendering a judgment or making a quasi judicial decision. It would participate in a legal action.
Yeah. So yeah, this is
as a party.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're executive branch, right? Right. And so we don't act as judges. We don't have any kind of
sure. That's what was confusing me.
Totally understand. And that actually sometimes has been kind of a confusion in the legislative discussion. The point of this office isn't to be a decider, right? That is, of course, the role of the Land Use Board of Appeals, then the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, right? Obviously. But really what the HAPO has this kind of authority, they have obviously like planners and housing experts, right? All these types of things that do understand state housing laws. And this kind of provides them that authority, to be that resource, to be kind of this kind of off branch, right, for all these different types of potential actions that can kind of avoid that process. But also it gives them the authority to participate, similar to other types of parties, in land use decisions, and of course, to be able to remedy potential violations.
Thank you.
Is this a recognition that there is some sort of jam up here when it comes to the LCDC or LUBA processes? In other words, is there a big long line of cases that impede any progress in this regard?
I would say it is a kind of a recognition that the state has been adopting a lot of different housing laws, right? In relationship to how development is regulated. Obviously, middle housing is a pretty big example of that, but there are a lot of other laws that have been passed that are, like very specific, that get into XYZ housing type or XYZ situation. And that, like for the most part, the application or implementation of law is fairly imperfect. Oftentimes you have codes that are old, maybe they haven't been updated since the 1980s. And there are places where they can create friction in the development process. Maybe, a code that improperly applies discretionary standards or regulates middle housing in a way that's inconsistent with statute or something like that. And the point of this office is to say, hey, we want to make sure we have this resource that is, a series of experts on these different laws to make sure that they're being implemented as the legislature intended.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, Miles, did you have another question?
Excuse me, no.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the other two roles that this office plays that are identified in the statute. These are also very important. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is coordination of different state agencies. So I'm sure almost anybody who's participated in the development process, they're familiar with the fact that it's not just local governments that participate in development applications, right? There's a lot of different state agencies that have intersections with these different, with the development of housing. And these include obviously like infrastructure, things like ODOT or DEQ or Business Oregon. They also include things like financing, say subsidized affordable housing financing that OHCS distributes. All these agencies kind of have this role or different roles in the production of housing. But, and I think this is probably pretty obvious to most people, they don't really do a good job talking to each other or coordinating around this idea that our goal is to produce housing, right? So you end up having this kind of lack of coordination between these different state agencies. A second function of this office is to serve as a coordinating entity between these different state agencies around the goal of housing production. And that includes coordinating different funding streams, coordinating different policies and programs, at different state agencies that intersect with the housing production process to ensure that we're reducing barriers to development, right? So an example of this would be like, maybe a local government wants to partner with an affordable housing developer to get XYZ project. They are struggling to find funding. And one of the intended roles of this office is to say, hey, here are these different kind of funding sources that we know are administered by these different programs, right, that you'd be able to access, right, and to be able to kind of serve as that coordinating entity that bridges the gap between these different agencies. So that's another intended function for this office. I'll also pause there just to see if we have any questions about that. Seems straightforward. Okay. I will say it's probably the least straightforward of the things on this page, but it's going to be interesting. Certainly, I think a lot of folks have recognized the need both for state investment and coordination of resources. And a big part of the intent behind this office is to serve that kind of functionality and to start building that capacity out. Of course, what it looks like, I think that's going to be a function of the Housing Accountability and Production Office to figure out, but is a very important tool. And then the last piece, and this one is also a little bit straightforward. You have all these, funding experts, coordination experts. You have also all these housing law like experts, right? That type of thing. And there's a lot of different provisions that are intended to provide both studies, best practices, research into housing production to provide these resources, both for obviously the legislature, but also for individuals too. So one of the big pieces, and this connects to another bill that we had that came during the 2024 short session, is the development of things like model codes, right? And that could be used to develop or adopted by local governments that help support the development of housing. An example of this would be like a model or best practice set of procedures, right? That a local government could take off the shelf and be able to apply at the local level. There's also other examples of things like ready build plans. These are plans that have essentially been pre-reviewed by building code officials because we have a state building code, and could be available. Essentially, a jurisdiction can say, we like these housing types, so we're just going to streamline their approval through a very simple process. And that's a resource that this office would provide. And then finally, a series of kind of studies around broader barriers and opportunities to production, things like public facilities planning, things like infrastructure investment, things like building codes, provisions, just looking into all of these different kind of areas of policy to provide these kind of technical studies that could potentially address barriers in future legislative policy initiatives. So that's kind of the intent behind this last piece. It's really to serve as this broader kind of series of technical and best practice resources, both for local governments, but also for other folks involved in the housing production process. So I think with that, I'll maybe take a pause. Are there any questions just overall about the office? These are really just kind of the three major functions of the office. I can also talk through maybe some of the timelines or anticipated kind of upcoming next steps that we would see with the office as well.
You've done a really good job, Sean.
Oh, yeah. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, very, very knowledgeable in what you're talking about through a very complicated process. So hopefully we get more of your time as this evolves.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you guys for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Would folks be, maybe I should just speak a little bit to next steps just on the Housing Accountability and Production Office. So this policy was passed pretty recently. I think the ink is just drying on the bill signing. And so the first step, so the office is supposed to be up and running and functional on July 1st of 2025. So that's a little over a year from now, right? And so what that means that the HAPOS kind of has to do in order to be able to function on that date is essentially do everything that's necessary to staff the office. So you have to hire people, you have to develop the grant systems, you got to develop all the administrative functions, you have to develop those procedures that I mentioned, right? Like how does the HAPO intake complaints? How do they respond to different things? How do they provide technical assistance to local governments? All of those things need to be essentially set up over the next year. So the agency has our work cut out for us. So there's going to be a lot that's coming up in the coming months. Of course, there's going to be a lot of questions that we're going to need to answer as we get into that. But I think what folks can expect externally is that there'll be kind of a series of conversations that we'll have as the agency to kind of talk through, right? How should the HAPO function in response to this or that? In light of our statutory direction that we'll be engaging with, of course, with local planners. And of course, the very competent staff that Lake Oswego has to make sure that the office is functioning the way it's intended once that date comes along. So I think with that, I'm happy to maybe stop sharing screen, see what other things folk might want to talk about in relationship to kind of state law, the HAPO, or the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and maybe we can just see what questions folks have, and if we want to wrap things up.
Sean, hi, Johanna Hasty, planning manager. Really quickly, I was just wondering, is there going to be a designated staff person at HAPO that each jurisdiction gets, or are they going to be allocated like a region? I'm wondering about the continuity of the questions that are probably going to come up as we're looking at code amendments or exemptions, things like that.
Yeah. So let's maybe crack the hood a little bit. So this is an agency. So it's an office that's a joint office between DLCD and Building Codes Division. So it is still part of those two agencies. And so in DLCD, with specific like reference to land use policy, so not talking about building codes, we still have regional reps, right? And a big part of that coordination that we do with local governments will be with regional reps. How exactly that happens, we don't know, because we don't know what those procedures look like, right? But no, the office will not be assigning like specific staff people to specific regions necessarily. What the HAPO, I believe, consists of, if you like look at the FTEs, is you have one essentially manager of the kind of overall like office, and as well as kind of a series, maybe I believe it's about 3 planners whose job is to like be that kind of state housing law expertise, right? So that intersection of state housing laws with local development codes, so 3 folks. And then I believe another 2 folks who are intended to be those navigators, right? That connecting with the funding piece, the coordination side of it. We also have a coordinator too as well to help with that as well. So, right, limited staff, but it's also just an emerging office. But yeah, I think a lot of that kind of connection with local governments will be coordinated with the regional reps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I also know that's way too long of an answer, so I apologize. But yeah, Philip.
Hey, Sean, thank you again. This was really, really informative to me, and I think everybody. Your discussion about the HAPO office seemed to tie a lot to sort of the DCLD side of it. Can you talk a little bit more about the building code division's role in this? Because to me, building codes are a lot more they're a lot more black and white, right? They're, building codes are basically set to meet minimum requirements, and that's what it is. So so where does sort of the gray happen here, or is
and I should mention a lot of the implementation of those particular laws. So BCD, and something for context for folks in the state of Oregon, we have I believe people refer to it as like a min-max code for building codes, right? So the state sets this broader set of building codes that kind of every jurisdiction kind of adheres to in the state of Oregon, and they are administered by local building officials. But BCD has this kind of broader role, obviously updating that code, making sure that it's up to date and reflects best practices and standards, all that type of stuff, but also providing customer service to folks. I should mention, I can't speak exactly to what building codes their precise role is, because I want to defer to their agency into articulating exactly what their role is. But what is articulated in the statute is this recognition that they serve that kind of customer service side of it to be a resource for, maybe housing developers that are hitting building code issues and they need understanding of different building code laws, or an understanding of how they intersect with local development processes, as well as this recognition that there are going to be these areas that have a degree of overlap or joint responsibility between DLCD and the building codes division. A great example of this are ready build plans. So if you have a set of plans that are reviewed by building code division, they're ready to go, well, then you have the land use side of it. Is this actually allowed in different areas? Is it being adopted and utilized to actually result in production on the ground? That's an example of a joint responsibility that we would have that would be part of this office. And one of the things that we're kind of in the process of doing right now with BCD is we have to set up an agreement about, how exactly do we interface with each other? What do those roles and responsibilities look like? That's something that's kind of underway right now.
Okay, because my thought has always been, if I'm a developer, and I have a question about a building code, or I'm asking about an exemption or something, I'll go to my local jurisdiction, to the building official, and they'll grant me a judgment. And as far as I know, the local jurisdiction's decision is what stands. So I guess I'm not clear on then what sort of this other role is, if the building official still has a say, or do they?
Yeah, so building officials, their job is to administer the state building code, essentially, right? There are maybe minor tweaks that can happen between the state and local government, but for the most part, unlike land use regulations, which are mostly locally decided, but with this kind of broader state oversight of, we have these different land use goals and that type of thing, state building codes are much more prescriptive, right? And so the local building official is the person who makes these determinations. But for example, sometimes cities don't even have local building officials, right? So what do you do about housing production in those cases, right? So BCD provides a lot of support and customer service in the development process to local governments and builders around that intersection of what do building codes say about XYZ issue, that type of thing. And I think the intent is to really ingratiate the two offices to not only provide that customer service explicitly, and in fact, a lot of their staff already do that, but to also make sure that there's this connection and touch point with the land use side of things to ensure that we're addressing this holistically. And that includes these kind of broader joint responsibilities that our two agencies are intended to have.
Okay, yeah, thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I should mention one of the things that I should note about this: the people who know the day-to-day interactions and services that BCD provides is BCD. So I don't want to speak too much about what their precise role is. I just want to provide that caveat. I'm certainly not the expert on building codes. All right.
Any other questions?
No.
Director Numanoglu?
No, I was just going to say, Sean, you've been very generous with your time, and we really appreciate you staying on and answering all of our questions. I want to echo what everyone else has said. You've done an absolutely fantastic job. And what I will say is Sean often is a panelist in local planning conferences and seminars. And whenever I see his name on it, I generally try to attend that session because I know it's going to be good. So fantastic job, Sean, and really big thanks to you for coming and speaking to us tonight.
Well, I am both embarrassed and thankful, appreciative. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Have a wonderful night, and I will see you all later.
All right.
And I should mention, please feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions. Of course, we have a general housing email that folks can reach out to. Of course, I believe I've shared my contact information too. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. And yeah, have a wonderful night.
Amen.
Okay, move on to item 8, schedule review.
All right, I will keep this quick. Before I get to the schedule review, I just want to give you a very quick update on the urban and community forestry plan process. The last time that this commission saw it was during a joint work session in January. Since that time, we've had 2 work sessions with the city council, one in February and one that just occurred on May 21st. We are almost to the end of that process. The final plan will hold a public hearing, on June 18th with the city council. So if you are interested in that, definitely want to review the record ahead of time and participate or view the public hearing on June 18th. As far as the upcoming schedule, June 10th is your next meeting. And at that meeting, we will have a study session on stormwater code amendments. And these are code amendments that our engineering division is working on. It's stormwater. It's kind of a technical review, but because it is in Chapter 50, it is in our land use code. And so we are required to have a recommendation to the city council on those code amendments that are sort of land use to the city council. So we'll have a study session on June 10th. And then the big item is a study session on June 24th for our first draft housing production strategy. So that is a huge milestone. And the good news is that Planning Manager Olson will be back. He will be back from parental leave, I think on June 10th, although I'm not sure he's going to be attending that meeting, but he will be at the meeting on June 24th. And that is all of the updates I have.
I had one thing for you.
Hmm?
I asked it at the end of our last session, and I don't know if the question forced you into a coughing spell that you never recovered from, but the question was about field trips. And we would love to do more of them.
Yeah, and my recollection is that's something I will be happy to coordinate with Planning Manager Olson when he returns. But yeah, absolutely, we can look into doing some more field trips and getting out. In the past, we've done some neighborhood association tours, so that might be something that we could look into. But yeah, let me talk to Planning Manager Olson when he returns, and we'll look into that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, unless any other questions, comments, thoughts?
This was
Otherwise,
a question. I don't know, for as young as Sean is, he sure knows a lot. And it was pages of notes. And the scary thing is I kind of understood it. So hats off again to him and how he explained it.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see that he would be our presenter. So yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, let's adjourn.
Okay.
Good night.
Okay, thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody.